Well, when did we meet?
We met about 1974, the age of 14, in a youth group, a Jewish youth group thing, which we were both in, and we became friends very quickly and stayed in
fairly quickly.
Fairly quickly, I don't want to over-exaggerate this. And we worked on, within this youth group, we used to work on various shows and things like that together, and bits and pieces of presentations, all that sort of stuff. And we kept in contact throughout university. And then I went to America. I was in America from 82 to 86, and when I came back, we said, I was in BBC Radio, and we said, let's try an improv show thing. So we came up with the format and everything together.
We did the first radio show, also as a pilot, just a one-off. And the buzz that generated was enormous. It was absolutely fantastic. And partly, I was going to say, was because of the cast.
Yeah, it was
Dan
amazing.
had assembled the dream cast, which was John Sessions and Stephen Fry. And remember, this is before Stephen was very famous, and Lenny Henry and Dawn French. And I think people forget that. And that
we
was
walked in there and just
cast.
went, I've died and gone to heaven. I mean, you know, and I also thought, oh, this is easy. And then we could never get them back on again. We've tried and tried to get Dawn and Lenny back on, and they wouldn't do it. But they were great in the pilot, and they were really, really good. And actually, the pilot, we could have cut 2 shows out of that, I think. I mean, the radio thing was great.
I can't believe you're still thinking in those terms.
Although, interestingly, I found a piece recently for, our script from the pilot. There were only about 6 games in it. I mean, it was just, very, very few things. I always remember there was a piece after the radio ones where the writer, I'll remember her name in a minute, said there's queues around the block and there's something wonderful and different happening here. And I think that's what helped spark television interest. It's a piece in the Telegraph or Times, and it just said this is really something revolutionary, and people were going nuts for it. And there was this very strange thing that happened where I'd only just got a job in radio. I'd only been there about 18 months, and suddenly Hat-Trick said, we've got an offer to do a pilot for Channel 4, and we thought that's great. And then we said, we've got an offer to do a pilot and 6 shows, and then an offer to do a pilot and 13 shows, and this was all happening, and I was getting a call each day, and I had to sort of call my parents and say, actually, I'm going to leave the BBC, and they were, all their life, they'd wanted me to get into the BBC, and I finally got in, and after, really, I mean, I'd done Saturday Night Fry, which was quite successful. This was the first proper hit, and after that one, to go straight off to television with no guarantees past that first show was nerve-wracking. And the most nerve-wracking thing about it was the regulars on the radio one were John Sessions and Stephen Fry. And we had good extra people in it, but those were really the people that made it, definitely. And so it went to television, and it was going to be Clive in the chair and Stephen Fry and John Sessions, and that was going to be. And we went to America to start auditioning people. And while I was there, we got a call saying Stephen's not going to do it. I was thinking, oh God, what's that going to do? I've left my job at the BBC and we're going there, and Steve's like, he's not going to do it. And then we got another call saying, oh, John's now not going to do it. And that was a terribly sort of frightening moment of going, well, without those two, the show just falls apart. We haven't got anything without them, and I can't believe Channel 4 will take it without them. So when we got back, we went out for dinner with John and Stephen was very good, because he said to John, look, I'm not going to do it, it's not my thing, I'm petrified doing it, but John, it is your thing, you're great at this. And he said, if it makes any difference, John, if you weren't doing it, I would still do it. Don't pull out because I'm not doing it anymore. And he talked John into doing it, and of course, without John, I think it wouldn't have worked. I mean, I think it progressed and moved into a different direction after a couple of series, but certainly for the first couple of series, John was the person that everybody talked about.
He was so exciting, wasn't he? He was erudite and sort of intelligent, and he used to do pastiches of authors, and you felt the author was speaking, Hemingway and Jane Austen. I mean, anybody he would do.
D.H. Lawrence he did on radio, which was absolutely great. And I think he did it again on TV. No, John was brilliant. And it's actually, interestingly, for the stuff Mark and I did together, I think it was the only time we've ever had really brilliant reviews was because we had John and Stephen doing this very clever, erudite stuff, and all the reviewers loved all that. So that's marvellous. When it went a bit more populist, I think the reviews were less positive.
Yes. Although I think you remember when we went to the States, we had fantastic reviews in America as well.
Yes, that's
and
true.
Other things in my life I've had great reviews for.
Yeah,
so
just, working with me, I think.
I guess.
Yeah. People have asked us why we chose Clive as the host. I mean, there was a show called The Cabaret Upstairs, and Clive was the compere of it. And in between the acts, which was basically stand-ups, he would interview people in the audience. And that was as funny as the stand-up stuff. He was just great interviewing people in the audience. He'd remember a bit of information from this guy and use it back later then. He was very, very quick. And when we were doing Whose Line and we realised that we needed to take a lot of stuff from the audience, we thought rather than making that just functional, let's make that actually a positive, interesting part of the show. And so, although Clive was actually not that experienced, and he certainly hadn't done any television, we realised that if we had him doing it, that would be a great part. And it was, and he was very quick with the audience, and when he went out and we'd get stuff for the musicals, he'd chat with them. That was 30 seconds, which was quite funny in itself. It wasn't just something that we had to do.
And if you look at Clive in the early shows, it's a kind of fun game to play. You can see how nervous he is, and you can see he's sweating.
I mean, the pilot. I mean, Clive actually, we did put a little piece at the beginning of the pilot where Clive said, and you'll see my very nervous brother hosting this thing. But it was extraordinary because we'd done 6 on radio and he was very comfortable doing that and excellent. And then on the pilot, I mean, he's just sitting there and he's sweating and his knuckles are white. And, as we all know, Clive got very good at doing it, very comfortable, but it does take people time. But that one, it was just extraordinary seeing it. I mean, there was such a tension there. Funny enough, the pilot's quite interesting for a number of reasons. Number one, because of the set, which my tactful friend...
They designed this. I was only working part-time at this point. I was, my full-time job, I worked for local authorities. I was, oddly enough, as a housing officer. I used to run the housing policy unit at the London Borough of Waltham Forest. And I only ever did this as a hobby with Dan. So he'd designed the set, or arranged for a designer to design the set for the pilot, and invited me to come and have a look at it. And it was like an airport terminal, this set. It was supposed to be like a sort of, give the sense that it was a late night edgy comedy show, sort of a bit sort of, theatre and dangerous and improvised. And it was blue, and it was bright, and it was glaring light.
And all of this is fair enough. There's no problem with all of this, but Mark did say it looks like an airport terminal standing right next to the designer. Which was an awkward and difficult moment. But you'll see that after the pilot, we went back to and made it red and simplified it. And there was this, and red and black. But I mean, it's interesting, the early shows, when we look back at them, they're so dark. And it was partly because there wasn't a lot of set to put light on. And over the years, you'll see we added more and more gauze, so you could put blue light onto it. And by, series 7, 8, 9, 10, it is much lighter. But the early days, I think there's some wonderful stuff in it, but it is so dark, and we're going, what was their sort of budget on how much electricity we could use or something? It's incredibly shadowy and whatever. But it was, I think at the time, it was quite unusual to have something which was that minimalist. I mean, we know there was Have I Got News, and they think it's all over in Buzzcocks, but we were the first of those really to do it, except for other kinds of similar shows which were very BBC One or ITV, which were very glitzy. And to have this sort of antidote to those shows, to have something where there was very little set, very little production values, just quite a dark sort of thing, I think was very interesting. And funny enough, that a lot of people only watched the first few series because they'd always come up and say, oh, I love that show, it's so minimalist. I mean, there was nothing there, it was just black. And it was like that for the first couple of series, but gradually we did start putting more and more set and light and stuff in. On the radio, everyone used to say, oh, was it weird then taking it to television? But to be honest, it was weird taking it to radio because my experience of it was on stage. So you take something to radio, it means you immediately couldn't do anything visual. You couldn't do props, you couldn't do the film dub, and a lot of the comedy is visual. So it had to be of its nature very verbal. When we went to, if you look at the pilot, there's a game we play called Party Quirks. And in that one, you can see the stage origins of it because John Glover, who is guessing the thing, say, all right, John, you go off. This is what we did on stage. So he disappears. And then we say to the other three, right, you're going to be a pirate, you're going to be an airline pilot, you're going to be something else. And then he comes back on. And it's very un-TV. It's sort of, we're just doing what we did on stage. And we realised once we got that going for the first show that the way around that was to give people envelopes and put it up on the screen so the person didn't have to walk off the set and not hear something, which is a very, very theatrical device. And actually, the other thing, if you notice about the pilot, is it's the only show where they don't read the credits on the British shows. And that was because we did it in radio. In radio, at the end of a show, somebody will say, and that was Whose Line Is It Anyway, starring Stephen Fry and John Sessions. The producer was Dan Patterson, blah, 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 and they'll do that. And we thought, then when we were there, we had an announcer doing that, and Stephen, I think it was, said, oh, God, it just seems so dull at the end of this show. Why don't we get one of us to do it? And then we said, well, let's do it as a prize and give you a style to do it in, and that came out of that.
And the rest, they say,
is boring.
Yeah.
Well, and then when we did the first show on TV, we said, well, you can't read the credits on TV. It just seems ridiculous. So we gave the pilot in without that. And Seamus Cassidy said, well, what happened to the thing where they were reading the credits? And we said, oh, you want that, do you? So that was fine. Then when we went to America and did the America series, they said, oh, you can't possibly have them read the credits. That was just right. You can't do that. And we said, well, it's always a great way to, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. So we did the whole series without reading the credits. And then they came to us and said, we feel it's such a shame they're not doing something at the end because people will switch off. Is there something you could do? And we said, well, no, we've recorded it all now, and you told us not to. So if you look at the America series, from the second series onwards, we did do the reading of the credits again, but that was only after enormous fun.
One of the interesting facts about the radio show, for connoisseurs out there, is that I used to sit next to Clive Anderson at the desk. And one of the great losses, I always thought, when it transferred to television, was that I was moved away from Clive at the desk and shoved in a back room somewhere.
Yeah, there was a lot of
cupboard.
Thought that went into that, and decided that Mark was probably better not on stage. But that he used to score it. Mark, radio tradition, we did kind of score it. So Mark was sitting there, and he was on headphones to me, and he'd score it, and Clive would then look at what Mark had done and said, the winner is so-and-so. And actually, when Clive is on the shows himself and he's writing, he did in a way kind of try and say who had won.
But probably not as well as I did.
Not as well as you did. And it got very surreal with Clive. I mean, it was this thing of saying you've got 1 million points, you've got one. But there was an interesting thing with Clive, which was he could sort of get away with it, but I think it helped the whole show was whenever they tried to do improv shows before that, they didn't have it as a host and performers like a game show, a quasi-game show thing. It was just a troupe. So they would come on and say, okay, can we have something from the audience, shout something out, okay, we're going to do this as Shakespeare, okay, here we go. There was just a little element of smugness about it, which I think you don't get in the theatre because you're there as part of the audience. But when you're watching it on television, I think you do, it just feels a little bit smug, I think is the right word, even though it's not deliberately like that. And I think by having Clive put it on them, they became the victims. So it was like this thing of Clive would be, in a way, being slightly mean to them, and you felt a sympathy with them, and it's like, wow, how are they going to do this? Because we put this on them rather than, okay, we're going to show you how great we are. There was the Clive playing sort of Mr. Nasty, and then they do it, and Clive would always say, that was the worst example of that I've ever seen. I'm giving you no points. So his slightly undercutting of it, I think, helped that edge. I think it helped sympathise with the performers. And I mean, it was all genuinely improvised. The question we get asked most, and we always have done, is was it genuinely improvised? And we used to say, you've got an audience member sitting in Clive's shot. You can see, we'd always keep those in. If somebody shouted out and he's sitting just there, we would keep that. Or occasionally we got a shot of the person shouting it out, and they would always say, I can't believe it's improvised, it's too good. And occasionally some of the performers would say, oh, I'm getting all these things saying it's too good, why don't you keep in the bits that are bad? And occasionally when it was a show that wasn't very good, we did keep in the bits that were bad. And everyone would say, oh, that wasn't a very good show. I mean, it was this catch-22 that if it was good enough to be really wonderful and entertaining, people thought it was too good to be improvised. But the truth was, it was 100% improvised.
We used to just take it as a compliment. If the public was saying, oh, surely that's not improvised, then I think that was absolutely down to the performers being fantastic.
And we used to really go out of our way to make sure that they hadn't seen the props, that they didn't know the stuff. We would rehearse it in the afternoon, so we'd get the cameras into position, but it was always giving them different stuff to what they would get that night. So they'd know they were playing film and theatre styles, or they know they were playing World's Worst, but we'd give them a different one to do in the afternoon, so that you really got the spontaneity and the danger in the evening. And it worked, because I think there might have been once or twice when something inadvertently was repeated, and it just was never as good the second time. It was always better if you really got their initial reaction to it. So we went out of our way to make sure that it was genuinely improvised.
If you look at the very early shows, the suggestions that they were given from us, sort of from the show itself, were very simple, very plain.
Like a pirate. There's one by Jonathan Pryce, I think, is just a pirate.
That's all he was. Yeah, it was in Party Quirks.
Yeah, and later on, we started realising, well, something happens. If you watch an improv show in the theatre, it's a different audience every night. So if they come in and shout out porn film, it doesn't matter because that audience hasn't seen porn film. But on TV, you have to assume that everybody is watching all the shows, which in certain cases is not a correct assumption, but let's assume they're all watching all the shows. It does mean that you've got to have different suggestions. You can't do porn film because we've done porn film. I mean, even so, Ingmar Bergman and Nativity and amateur productions came up a lot. But you had to assume that you were trying to make it different each time. So as you see the series go on, you know, from series 1 to 10 and even more in the American ones, more and more of the suggestions came from us because we would sit there all week working out suggestions to give them, whereas an audience will just shout out the first thing they think of. And very often they're trying to be funny.
Again, they'd never see them. When you said they came from us, the performers would never know them.
No, it was still completely improvised. But we, as the show, would start giving. So we would, instead of giving a pirate, would say a pirate with a case of dysentery, or you know, a pirate who only robs idiots, or something like that. That would give it more of a twist and make them interact more than just a pirate. But we did 120 episodes here and another couple of hundred in America. And in that amount of stuff that you're doing, it became harder and harder to do things that they hadn't done before. And also you get audiences come along, like with a rock band, who want their greatest hits. So they're shouting out Nativity because they've seen Tony and Josie do Nativity before, and they think, oh, that's great. So they shout it out because they want to see it again. And it's fine, but you can't keep having the same thing. So it is a difference to the theatre. And the other thing I was going to say, you haven't asked me, but I am going to say, this is the biggest thing, I think, difference between doing it in theatre and doing it on TV, is you can go along to a theatre improv troupe and see them. They may be great and they may be bad. And on a night they're bad, you've paid your 10 quid, you've had your drinks, you're part of the audience, you've had a nice night out, it doesn't matter. On TV, you can't go to the commissioning editor and say, oh, sorry, the show didn't work tonight. We haven't got a show. It always had to work. You've got to have a show at the end of it. So it means that it can't be all right. It means there's all sorts of things that stem from that. You've got to have the best performers. You know, people sometimes say, why didn't you have so-and-so? Why didn't you take more risk? But the truth of the matter is, it only worked with people who were great. You had to make sure that the games you did would work. Because if we did a game that didn't work, that was fine. If you did 2 games that didn't work, everyone would start losing confidence in it. The performers would start losing confidence, so they'd go very sweary or very big or druggy or whatever it was. And so it puts the bar up there, so any clever stuff that anyone comes out afterward doesn't really work. So you always had to make sure that if we had a new game to try, we'd always put it in between 2 games that we knew would work. And there were some episodes, I remember very clearly there was one where we'd done about 8 episodes and Mark said, oh, we got this one in the bag. And for some reason after that, no other game worked. And we used to have this. That's
at least 12 or 15 years.
I know, I've been harbouring that. But there was this sort of cycle.
It wasn't my fault.
No, it's coincidence. It is coincidence. It's jinxing the thing. But there was a cycle of confidence.
No, you just said jinxing it. No, it wasn't my fault.
No, it wasn't. Well, scotch that. But sometimes if they were going really well, it would go like that and spiral up. And if it was going very badly, it would spiral down. And it was very difficult once it was spiraling down to get it back going again. Everybody, and the audience would lose confidence. And we have this rule, which was that on a good night, everything goes well. It's a sort of truism, but it was the case. On a bad night, everything would go badly. So just at the point where you're desperate for a good suggestion to get this game going, somebody in the audience will shout out a crap suggestion, which Clive will then take, give it to them, or there would be something where they quoted a Beatles lyric, and we can never get Beatles lyric. And so we'd have to stop and say, don't do that. And at which point, Clive and all the performers would then start thinking it was terribly amusing to pick up on this thing that we couldn't use. So you'd have an hour of stuff about Beatles lyrics that we knew we couldn't use. But it was that thing, the show had to work. That was it. And fear, everything was based on fear, that at the beginning of the night you had blank slate, there was nothing, and you had to have something at the end of the night.
Nobody has more to fear than the producer.
I used to look young. Look at me now. This is because of Whose Line, the fear of doing all of these shows.
We're both only 28.
Yeah, it's true. Actually, I'm 27.
You wish.